The Boeing 737 was 37,000 feet above the Atlantic when everything changed. Passengers dozed in their seats, flight attendants prepared the dinner service, and Captain Mitchell Barnes thought he was flying another routine red-eye from Boston to London. Then, the encrypted radio crackled to life with a message that would transform United Flight 447 into something no commercial pilot had ever faced. United 447, this is NORAD command. We have credible intelligence of an imminent terrorist action targeting your aircraft. You are ordered to divert immediately to Shannon International. Acknowledge. Barnes felt his blood turn to ice water. 23 years of commercial flying, and he'd never heard those words. His co-pilot, Janet Rodriguez, stopped mid-sentence in her weather report and stared at the radio. The cabin behind them hummed with the peaceful ignorance of 312 souls who had no idea their lives had just balanced on a knife's edge. NORAD, United 447 copies divert to Shannon. Can you advise nature of threat? Static filled the cockpit for 15 seconds that felt like hours. Then, 447, we have reason to believe there are armed individuals aboard your aircraft planning to take control. We need someone with combat experience to assist. Do you have any military personnel on your passenger manifest? Barnes ran through the crew roster in his mind. Rodriguez had been Air Force but transport planes, not combat. The flight attendants were civilians. He was about to respond negatively when Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered, checking something on her tablet. Seat 21A, the manifest shows military designation, combat veteran. Barnes keyed the radio again. "NORAD, we may have someone stand by." What neither pilot knew was that the sleeping figure in seat 21A wasn't just any veteran. Lieutenant Colonel Sage, Reaper. Blackwood had spent 8 years flying A-10 Warthogs over Afghanistan and Iraq, earning a Distinguished Flying Cross and a reputation that made hardened Marines step aside when she walked into a briefing room. She'd also spent the last 2 years trying to forget why they called her Reaper, why she'd resigned her commission, and why she hadn't slept well since her last combat mission. The flight attendant approached her seat cautiously. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, athletic build visible even in civilian clothes, dark hair pulled back severely. Her face, peaceful in sleep, bore a small scar along the left jawline that suggested stories the airline manifest would never tell. Ma'am, I need you to wake up." Reaper's eyes opened instantly, fully alert. No gradual awakening, no confusion. Her hand moved instinctively to where her sidearm would have been, finding only empty air. The flight attendant stepped back involuntarily. "What's the situation?" Reaper's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death decisions. "The captain needs to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." Reaper unbuckled her seatbelt and followed the attendant forward, her mind already running threat assessments. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in movies and magazines, unaware that their safe passage home now depended on a woman who'd spent years learning to kill efficiently from 30,000 feet. Captain Barnes turned as she entered the cockpit, taking in her appearance with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She looked more like a business traveler than a warrior, but her bearing told a different story. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death. "Colonel Blackwood, I'm Captain Barnes. NORAD has informed us of a credible terrorist threat aboard this aircraft. They believe armed individuals are planning to take control of the plane. We need your expertise." Reaper absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her pulse quickened slightly. She'd hoped never to hear words like these again, had prayed her fighting days were over. But 37,000 feet above a dark ocean, with hundreds of innocent lives at stake, her personal demons seemed suddenly irrelevant. "How many suspected hostiles?" she asked. "Unknown. Intelligence suggests at least 3, possibly more. They may be planning to wait until we're closer to London before making their move." Reaper nodded, her mind shifting into tactical mode despite herself. Weapons. Unknown, but they apparently made it through security somehow. She moved to the cockpit window, looking out at the vast darkness below. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, its black surface occasionally catching starlight like scattered diamonds. Up here, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Just her skills, whatever weapons they could improvise, and the hope that 8 years of combat experience would be enough to save everyone aboard. "I'll need a complete passenger manifest, seating chart and crew positions," she said finally. "Also, I need to know exactly what resources we have available. Anything that could be used as a weapon, any crew with relevant training, and a detailed layout of the aircraft." Rodriguez handed her the requested information, and Reaper spread the documents on the navigator's station. Her finger traced potential sight lines, choke points, areas where passengers could be evacuated or protected. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. She'd spent 2 years trying to escape this feeling, this burden of holding other people's lives in her hands. But as she studied the aircraft layout, she realized something that both terrified and oddly comforted her. She was still good at this. The question was whether being good at killing would be enough to save lives 37,000 feet above the ocean, with no backup, no extraction plan, and no room for error. In Afghanistan, she'd had an armored aircraft bristling with weapons. Here, she had her wits, her training, and whatever improvised tools they could gather from the galley and emergency equipment. "Colonel," Barnes prompted. Reaper looked up from the documents, her expression grim but determined. "Get me the senior flight attendant and start that diversion to Shannon. We're going to need every minute we can get." What she didn't say was that she could already feel the familiar ice forming in her veins, the cold calculation that had once made her the most feared close air support pilot in the Afghan theater. The Reaper was awakening, and God help anyone who threatened her passengers. The hunt was about to begin at 37,000 feet, and this time there would be no second chances for anyone. Barnes watched her study the passenger manifest with the intensity of a predator analyzing prey. He'd seen that look before, during his own military service, but never on a commercial flight. There was something both reassuring and deeply unsettling about having a trained killer in his cockpit, even if she was theoretically on their side. "How long to Shannon?" Reaper asked without looking up. 3 hours, 40 minutes at current speed and heading." She nodded, still absorbed in the documents. Her finger had stopped on a particular section of the manifest, and Barnes could see her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Whatever she was seeing there, it wasn't good news. "Problem, Colonel." Reaper looked up, and for just a moment, Barnes caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her eyes before the professional mask slammed back into place. 3 passengers purchased tickets within 24 hours of departure. Same credit card. Seats scattered throughout the cabin in tactically advantageous positions. The implications hit Barnes like a physical blow. Professional terrorists, organized and well-funded, with seats positioned to control the entire passenger compartment. This wasn't some desperate group with box cutters and delusions of martyrdom. This was a military operation disguised as commercial travel. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered. Reaper folded the manifest carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket. "Get me that senior flight attendant now. And Captain, when NORAD calls back, tell them we're dealing with professionals. This is going to get very ugly, very fast." As if summoned by her words, the radio crackled again. "United 447, NORAD Command. We have updated intelligence. The subjects may be planning to use your aircraft as a weapon against London. You are authorized to use any means necessary to prevent this scenario." The weight of those words settled over the cockpit like a death shroud. Any means necessary. Barnes had been in the military long enough to know what that phrase really meant. NORAD was giving them permission to sacrifice the aircraft and everyone aboard rather than allow it to be used as a flying bomb. Reaper keyed the radio herself. "NORAD, this is Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, call sign Reaper. I have tactical command of this situation. Send me everything you have on these subjects immediately." "Reaper," the voice on the radio carried a note of recognition. "Colonel Blackwood, this is Major General Patterson. I thought you'd left the service." "I did, but apparently the service hasn't left me." There was a pause then. "Reaper, if anyone can handle this, it's you. We're transmitting all available intelligence now. Good hunting." As the encrypted data streamed into the aircraft's communication system, Reaper felt the familiar pre-combat calm descending over her. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing deepened, and her mind began operating with the cold efficiency that had once made her legendary among the ground troops she'd protected. She was no longer Sage Blackwood, retired pilot trying to forget her past. She was Reaper, and she had work to do. The senior flight attendant, Maria Santos, entered the cockpit with obvious confusion and growing fear. She'd been flying for 12 years, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the grim expression she saw on the flight crew's faces, or the dangerous intensity radiating from the woman in civilian clothes who now seemed to command everyone's attention. "Maria," Reaper said, her voice carrying quiet authority, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to follow my instructions exactly. Lives depend on it." Maria nodded, her hands unconsciously gripping the back of the captain's chair. She could sense that whatever was happening, it was far beyond the scope of normal flight operations. "We have credible intelligence that there are armed terrorists aboard this aircraft. They're planning to take control and use this plane as a weapon. I'm going to stop them, but I need your help to do it without getting innocent people killed." The color drained from Maria's face. 12 years of routine flights, medical emergencies, unruly passengers, weather delays, nothing had prepared her for this moment. But as she looked into Reaper's steady gaze, she found herself nodding with more confidence than she felt. "What do you need me to do?" Reaper pulled out the manifest again, pointing to the 3 suspicious passengers. "I need you to visually identify these individuals without being obvious about it. Walk through the cabin normally, check on passengers, but pay special attention to these 3. I need to know their exact positions, what they're doing, and whether you can see any signs of weapons or coordination between them." "How will I know if they're the right people?" "They'll be alert when they should be sleeping. They'll be watching the crew and exits instead of entertainment screens, and they'll have positioned themselves to control sight lines and passenger movement." Reaper's expression darkened. "Trust me, once you know what to look for, they're not hard to spot." Maria took the manifest with trembling hands. The seat numbers seemed to burn themselves into her memory. 8F, 15C, 27A3 people who had boarded as ordinary passengers but were now revealed as instruments of murder and terror. "After you identify them, I need you to quietly brief the other flight attendants. Tell them we're dealing with a security situation and they need to be ready to follow emergency protocols on my signal. But Maria," Reaper's voice carried a note of steel, "if any of them panic or act suspicious, people are going to die. Make sure they understand that." As Maria left the cockpit, Reaper turned back to the intelligence data streaming in from NORAD. Photos, known associates, travel patterns, psychological profiles. The familiar machinery of warfare reduced to digital files on a small screen. But even as her tactical mind processed the information, a part of her wondered if she was strong enough for what was coming. In Afghanistan, she'd had armor, weapons, and backup. Here, she had nothing but her training, her wits, and the desperate hope that she could become the Reaper one more time without losing what was left of her humanity. Outside the cockpit windows, the stars wheeled silently overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding 7 miles below their ancient light. Soon, very soon, this peaceful cabin would become a battlefield, and Sage Blackwood would have to decide once again who lived and who died. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders. When she opened them again, the Reaper looked back at her from the reflection in the dark window. The hunt had begun. Maria Santos moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her smile perfectly calibrated to suggest routine service rather than desperate reconnaissance. To the sleeping passengers, she appeared to be conducting a standard welfare check, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached Seat 8F. The man sitting there was exactly as Colonel Blackwood had described. Mid-30s, athletically built, dark hair cropped short in a style that suggested military background. While other passengers slept or watched movies, his eyes constantly tracked the movement of crew members and the location of exits. When Maria approached with a blanket offer, he declined with a slight accent she couldn't place, but his gaze lingered on her uniform insignia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Seat 15C presented an equally unsettling picture. A woman, probably late 20s, wearing expensive business attire that couldn't quite conceal the lean muscle tone of someone who'd spent serious time in combat training. She'd positioned herself with clear sight lines to both the forward and aft galleys, and when Maria offered her a pillow, the woman's reflexive grip strength nearly crushed her fingers. The apologetic smile that followed was far too practiced to be genuine. By the time Maria reached Seat 27A, her professional composure was hanging by a thread. The third suspect was older, perhaps 45, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in harsh climates. Unlike his companions, he appeared to be sleeping, but Maria noticed his breathing was too controlled, too shallow. Real sleep had a different rhythm, and this man was merely resting while remaining tactically alert. As she completed her circuit of the cabin, Maria felt the weight of terrible knowledge settling over her. 3 trained killers sat among families returning from vacation, business travelers heading to meetings, students going back to university. All of them trusting in the normal operation of commercial aviation, none of them aware that their lives now depended on a woman they'd never met who was preparing for a battle none of them could imagine. Back in the cockpit, Reaper received Maria's whispered report with grim satisfaction. The intelligence had been accurate. 3 professionals, positioned to control the passenger cabin, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Probably planning to act somewhere over the Irish Sea, close enough to London to make their final run, but far enough from land to avoid immediate military intervention. They're definitely coordinated, Maria concluded. And Colonel, there's something else. All 3 of them have carry-on bags in the overhead bins directly above their seats, not scattered around like normal passengers. Reaper nodded. Weapons and equipment most likely, probably disassembled to avoid detection, designed to be quickly assembled when the operation began. These weren't amateurs with improvised weapons. This was a military strike team operating under cover of commercial travel. Maria, I need you to do something very dangerous, Reaper said quietly. I need you to identify those overhead bins and figure out a way to deny them access to their equipment when the time comes. How? Use your imagination. Spill drinks, create passenger disturbances, claim you need to inspect for shifting baggage. Anything that keeps them away from those bins when things start happening. Maria nodded, though her face had gone pale. She was a flight attendant, trained to serve coffee and handle medical emergencies, not to engage in tactical operations against professional killers. But something in Colonel Blackwood's manner inspired confidence even in the face of overwhelming fear. As Maria left the cockpit again, Reaper turned to Captain Barnes. I need to walk through the cabin myself, get a visual on the targets and assess the tactical situation. Is that wise, if they recognize you as military? They won't. Reaper's smile was cold. I've gotten very good at not looking like what I am. She stood and moved toward the cockpit door, then paused. "Captain, when this starts, and it will start, I need you to maintain course and altitude no matter what you hear from the cabin. Don't deviate, don't try to help, and don't open this door for anyone unless they give you the code word." "What's the code word?" "Warthog." Barnes nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know why she'd chosen that particular word. As Reaper left the cockpit, he found himself saying a silent prayer for the woman who just volunteered to stand between his aircraft and three professional killers armed with unknown weapons and unlimited malice. In the passenger cabin, Reaper moved with the casual grace of an ordinary traveler making her way to the restroom. But her trained eyes cataloged every detail: emergency exits, potential weapons, passenger positions, crew locations. She noted which travelers appeared fit enough to help in a crisis, and which would likely become liabilities. Most importantly, she studied her three targets with the detached professionalism of a predator evaluating worthy opponents. The man in 8F was good. His surveillance was subtle, his positioning optimal, his alertness disguised as ordinary awareness. But Reaper caught him tracking her movement in the reflection of his window, and she knew he'd identified her as a potential threat. When their eyes met briefly, she saw the recognition pass between them, predators acknowledging predators. The woman in 15C was equally professional, but younger, perhaps overconfident. She'd positioned herself perfectly to control passenger movement, but her choice of business attire suggested she underestimated the physical demands of close-quarters combat in an aircraft cabin. Her mistake, and one that Reaper intended to exploit. The older man in 27A was the most dangerous. When Reaper passed his seat, he appeared to be sleeping deeply, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated readiness for immediate action. This one was the team leader, experienced and disciplined. He'd let his subordinates reveal themselves while remaining hidden until the optimal moment. As she reached the aft restroom, Reaper allowed herself a moment to process what she'd learned. Three professionals, well-positioned, probably well-armed, with a plan they'd rehearsed and refined. Against them, she had surprise, superior training, and the desperate motivation of someone protecting innocence. It would have to be enough. She looked at herself in the restroom mirror, seeing the face that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemy combatants across two theaters of war. For 2 years, she tried to bury this part of herself, to become just another civilian trying to build a normal life. But standing in the cramped restroom of a commercial aircraft, surrounded by sleeping passengers who trusted her with their lives, she felt the familiar cold fire of combat readiness flowing through her veins. The Reaper was fully awake now, and she had work to do. When she returned to the cockpit, Barnes and Rodriguez were monitoring encrypted communications with NORAD and coordinating with Shannon International for their emergency landing. The plan was straightforward: land at Shannon, allow Irish security forces to board the aircraft, and hopefully resolve the situation without bloodshed. But Reaper knew it wouldn't be that simple. Professional terrorists didn't usually allow their plans to be disrupted by unexpected diversions. More likely, they'd accelerate their timeline and attempt to take control of the aircraft before reaching Shannon, which meant she had perhaps 90 minutes to prepare for a battle that would determine the fate of everyone aboard. "Any update from NORAD?" she asked. "They've identified the 3 suspects," Rodriguez replied. "Former military, all of them. The woman served in Russian Spetsnaz, the older man was Hezbollah Special Operations, and the younger man appears to be freelance with experience in several African conflicts." Reaper absorbed this information with growing respect for her opponents. These weren't fanatics or amateurs. They were seasoned professionals who'd chosen terrorism as a career path. They'd have contingency plans, backup weapons, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that came from surviving multiple combat deployments. What about their intended target? "Intelligence suggests they're planning to crash the aircraft into the London Eye during the evening rush hour," Barnes said grimly. Maximum casualties, maximum psychological impact. The weight of this revelation settled over the cockpit like a death shroud. Not just the 312 souls aboard the aircraft, but potentially thousands more on the ground. The London Eye would be crowded with tourists and commuters, the surrounding area dense with pedestrians and traffic. The death toll could reach into the tens of thousands. Reaper felt the familiar ice forming in her veins, the cold calculation that had once made her the most feared pilot in the Afghan theater. These terrorists had just made this personal by threatening innocent civilians on a massive scale. She'd spent her military career protecting people like the passengers sleeping behind her, and she wasn't about to stop now. NORAD also wanted me to pass along a message, Barnes continued. General Patterson says to tell you that if anyone can stop this, it's the pilot who saved Bravo Company at Kandahar. Reaper's expression darkened at the reference to her most famous and most costly mission. The day she'd earned her call sign and lost a piece of her soul in the process. But if these terrorists thought they could turn her aircraft into a weapon of mass destruction, they were about to learn why ground troops used to say a prayer of gratitude when they heard the distinctive roar of an A-10 Warthog approaching their position. She began planning her attack. The first priority was weaponry. Commercial aircraft weren't designed for combat, but years of military service had taught Reaper that everything could be a weapon if you understood its application. She sent Maria and the other flight attendants to quietly gather potential implements. Fire extinguishers for blunt force trauma, coffee pots filled with boiling water, heavy serving trays that could function as shields or clubs, even the beverage carts that could be used for ramming attacks in the narrow aisle. "Colonel," Maria whispered during one of her reporting sessions, "the passengers are starting to notice something's wrong. They're asking questions about why we're not serving dinner, why we keep moving around the cabin." "How much longer until they make their move?" Reaper asked Barnes. "At current speed and heading, we'll be over the Irish Sea in about an hour. If they're planning to divert toward London, that's probably when they'll act." Reaper nodded. The terrorists would want to be close enough to their target to prevent military interception, but far enough from land to avoid immediate ground-based intervention. The Irish Sea represented the optimal compromise between tactical necessity and operational security. "Maria, I need you to start moving passengers away from those 3 seats. Create some kind of distraction, medical emergency, mechanical problem, whatever you can think of. I want clear fields of fire when this starts." Fields of fire. Maria's voice carried a note of growing panic. "Combat zones," Reaper clarified grimly, "because that's what this cabin is about to become." As Maria left to begin evacuating passengers from the potential combat area, Reaper turned her attention to her own equipment. She'd been traveling with minimal personal items, but her military training had taught her to find utility in unexpected places. Her belt could serve as a garrote, her shoes had heavy heels suitable for striking vulnerable points, and her jacket contained several metal components that could be fashioned into makeshift weapons. But her most valuable asset was her mind, trained through years of combat to operate with deadly efficiency under extreme stress. She began running through tactical scenarios, identifying choke points and kill zones, planning her attack sequence to neutralize the greatest threats first, while minimizing risk to innocent passengers. The man in 27A would be her primary target. As the apparent team leader, his elimination would disrupt their coordination and potentially cause the others to act prematurely. The woman in 15C would be next. Her positioning made her the greatest immediate threat to passenger safety. The younger man in 8F would be dealt with last, assuming she survived long enough to reach him. Outside the aircraft, the stars continued their ancient dance across the night sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding 7 miles below. But inside the pressurized cabin, the atmosphere was thick with growing tension as passengers began to sense that something was terribly wrong with their routine flight to London. Reaper checked her watch. 53 minutes until they reached the Irish Sea. 53 minutes until three professional killers attempted to transform United Flight 447 into an instrument of mass murder. She closed her eyes and began the familiar pre-combat ritual, slowing her breathing, clearing her mind of everything except the immediate tactical situation. When she opened them again, the reflection in the cockpit window showed not the face of a retired pilot trying to escape her past, but the cold, determined visage of someone who'd earned her call sign through skill, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to let innocent people die on her watch. The Reaper was ready for war. At 37,000 feet above the North Atlantic, with no backup, no extraction plan, and no margin for error, she prepared to do what she'd done so many times before: stand between evil and innocence, and make sure only one of them survived the encounter. The battle for United Flight 447 was about to begin. As the digital clock counted down the minutes to combat, Maria Santos moved through the cabin with growing desperation, trying to implement Colonel Blackwood's evacuation plan without causing a panic. She'd chosen to fake a medical emergency, claiming that a passenger in the rear section was experiencing chest pains and needed space for treatment. The ruse worked better than she'd hoped. Concerned travelers willingly moved forward, creating the clear zones that Reaper had requested around the three terrorist positions. But as Maria shepherded passengers away from the danger areas, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was arranging deck chairs on the Titanic, organizing innocent people for a battle they couldn't imagine and wouldn't understand until the killing started. In the cockpit, Reaper received regular updates from Shannon International and NORAD. Irish security forces were mobilizing, RAF fighters were being scrambled, and emergency response teams were preparing for multiple scenarios. But all of that support would be useless if the terrorists succeeded in taking control of the aircraft and diverting toward London. "Reaper, this is General Patterson," came the encrypted radio transmission. "We're showing you at 47 minutes to intercept point. What's your status?" "Prepared to engage," Reaper replied tersely. "Passengers are being moved to defensive positions. Improvised weapons have been distributed to crew, and I have visual confirmation on all three targets. Be advised, we're tracking unusual radio traffic in the area. There may be additional support assets for the hostile team." Reaper felt her blood chill. She'd been planning for a contained engagement against three known opponents. The possibility of additional terrorists or external coordination changed everything. "What kind of support assets?" "Unknown. Could be anything from communication relay to backup personnel. Assume worst-case scenario." Worst-case scenario meant this wasn't just three professionals with a plan. It was part of a larger operation, probably with multiple contingencies and backup plans. The kind of sophisticated terrorist attack that required months of preparation and significant financial backing. "Copy that, NORAD. Reaper out." She turned to Barnes, her expression grim. "Captain, I need you to understand something. When this starts, it's going to be fast and brutal. You're going to hear things from the cabin that will make you want to intervene. Don't. Your job is to fly this aircraft and get us to Shannon. My job is to make sure we arrive with the passengers still alive and the terrorists dead." Barnes nodded, though his face had gone pale. "Colonel, there are families back there, children." "I know." Reaper's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made similar calculations too many times before. "That's why I'm going to win." With 35 minutes remaining until the estimated engagement point, Reaper made her final preparations. She moved through the cabin one last time, ostensibly helping with the medical emergency, but actually positioning herself for optimal tactical advantage. The three terrorists remained in their seats, maintaining their cover, but she could sense the growing tension in their posture as the aircrafts changed behavior. The early descent toward Shannon, the unusual crew activity, signaled that their operation had been compromised. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone aboard the aircraft could feel it building like an approaching storm. Reaper took her position near the center of the cabin, close enough to engage any of the three targets rapidly, but far enough from passengers to minimize collateral damage. She'd removed her jacket and shoes, preparing for the kind of close-quarters combat that demanded maximum mobility and minimal encumbrance. Around her, passengers continued to chat quietly or doze, blissfully unaware that their survival now depended on a woman whose military record was classified at levels most generals would never see. They trusted in the normal operation of commercial aviation, in the competence of the crew, in the fundamental assumption that their routine flight would end with a safe landing at their intended destination. Reaper envied them their innocence, even as she prepared to shatter it forever. The aircraft's communication system crackled with an incoming transmission, and she heard Captain Barnes' voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our initial descent into Shannon International due to a minor mechanical issue. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The coded language told Reaper everything she needed to know. The Irish Sea was 25 minutes away. The terrorists would act soon, probably within the next 10 minutes, as soon as they realized the aircraft was genuinely diverting rather than following its original flight path to London. She was right. The man in 27A was the first to move. His eyes snapped open with the alertness of someone who'd never actually been sleeping, and Reaper saw him reach toward the overhead bin above his seat. She was already moving before his hand touched the latch, covering the distance between them with the fluid grace of a predator closing on prey. But even as she moved, the woman in 15C was rising from her seat, and Reaper caught the metallic glint of something in her hand. A weapon that had somehow avoided detection by airport security, probably ceramic or composite materials designed specifically to defeat metal detectors. The younger man in 8F was turning in his seat, his hand reaching for his own overhead bin, when Maria Santos did something that probably saved dozens of lives. Without hesitation, she grabbed the nearest beverage cart and rammed it into the aisle, blocking his access to his equipment and creating a barrier between him and the other passengers. The battle for United Flight 447 had begun. Reaper's first target was the team leader in 27A, the older man whose experienced calm made him the most dangerous opponent. She struck him as he was reaching for his overhead bin, driving her elbow into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over. But he recovered faster than most people would have, pivoting away from her follow-up attack and revealing the kind of combat training that came from years of professional warfare. He had something in his hand now, a short blade that looked like it had been crafted from aircraft components, sharp enough to cut through seat fabric and human flesh with equal efficiency. His first swing nearly opened her throat, missing only because Reaper's combat reflexes threw her backward against the seat. "Gun!" screamed the woman in 15C, and suddenly the cabin erupted in panic as passengers realized their quiet flight had become a battlefield. But Reaper knew there was no gun, not yet. The woman was creating chaos to cover her companion's actions, relying on passenger panic to mask their movements and provide concealment for their attack. It was a sound tactical decision, but it revealed something important about their plan. They needed the passengers alive, at least initially, which meant they were planning to use the aircraft as originally intended rather than simply destroying it in flight. This gave Reaper a crucial advantage. She could use lethal force without restraint, while her opponents were constrained by their need to maintain operational security and passenger cooperation. The team leader came at her again, the improvised blade seeking her vital organs with professional precision. But 8 years of close air support missions had taught Reaper to operate under extreme stress, and her combat reflexes kicked in with deadly efficiency. She caught his wrist as he thrust toward her chest, using his own momentum to redirect the blade toward his throat. The older man tried to break away, but Reaper had locked onto him like a guided missile onto its target. Her knee drove into his solar plexus again, and this time he couldn't recover quickly enough to avoid her follow-up attack. Her elbow connected with his temple, and she felt something give way under the impact. He dropped to the cabin floor and didn't move. One down, two to go. But even as she turned toward her next target, the woman in 15C was moving with lethal purpose toward the forward section of the aircraft. In her hand was not a gun, but something potentially more dangerous in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. A ceramic blade designed to be undetectable by security scanners and sharp enough to cut through Kevlar body armor. She was heading for the cockpit. Reaper's blood turned to ice water as she realized the true scope of the terrorist plan. They didn't intend to take control of the aircraft by overwhelming the passengers and crew. They planned to kill the pilots and fly the plane themselves, using the chaos of combat to mask their approach to the flight deck. "Maria, stop her," Reaper shouted, but the flight attendant was already engaged in her own desperate battle with the younger terrorist, who had finally managed to retrieve his equipment from the overhead bin. Reaper had to make a choice: pursue the woman heading for the cockpit or neutralize the man who was now armed and threatening passengers. Both targets were equally dangerous, but in different ways. She chose the cockpit. The woman in 15C was halfway to the flight deck when Reaper caught up with her, tackling her from behind and driving them both into the bulkhead separating first class from the main cabin. The impact sent both women sprawling, but the terrorist recovered first, spinning with the ceramic blade in a backhanded arc that would have opened Reaper's throat if she hadn't rolled away at the last second. The blade sparked against the aircraft's metal framework, and Reaper realized with growing respect that her opponent was everything the intelligence files had suggested: fast, skilled, and absolutely ruthless. The woman's Spetsnaz training was evident in every movement, from her balanced stance to the way she held her weapon with relaxed confidence. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," the woman said in lightly accented English, her voice calm despite the violence around them. "Too many people will die if you resist." Reaper didn't bother responding. In her experience, terrorists who talked during combat were usually stalling for time, waiting for backup or trying to distract from some other aspect of their plan. Instead, she focused on the tactical situation: narrow space, armed opponent, innocent passengers nearby, and a cockpit door that absolutely could not be breached. The woman came at her with a series of precise attacks, the ceramic blade moving in patterns that spoke of extensive military training. But Reaper had learned close-quarters combat in places where hesitation meant death, and her response was brutally efficient. She caught the woman's knife hand at the wrist, twisted with enough force to snap bone, and drove her free elbow into her opponent's sternum. The ceramic blade clattered to the cabin floor as the woman doubled over, gasping for breath. But even with a broken wrist, she wasn't finished fighting. Her left hand shot toward Reaper's eyes, fingernails extended like claws, while her knee drove upward toward vulnerable organs. Reaper deflected the hand's strike and absorbed the knee impact on her thigh, accepting the pain to maintain her position. Her hands found the woman's throat, and she began applying the kind of pressure that would end the fight permanently. But in the aft section of the cabin, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The younger terrorist had finally accessed his equipment cache, and what he'd retrieved wasn't just a weapon. It was a sophisticated piece of electronics that he was now attempting to connect to the aircraft's passenger communication system. Maria Santos was fighting desperately to stop him, using a coffee pot as an improvised club, but he was stronger and had the advantage of tactical surprise. "He's got some kind of device," Maria screamed over the chaos of panicking passengers. "He's trying to plug it into something." Reaper's blood chilled as she realized what the device probably was: a remote piloting system designed to override the aircraft's controls and allow external guidance. The terrorists weren't just planning to take over the cockpit. They intended to fly the aircraft by remote control, probably guided by accomplices on the ground with sophisticated flight simulation equipment. This changed everything. With the woman in 15C unconscious beneath her hands, Reaper turned toward the aft cabin where the real battle was now taking place. But as she moved, she saw something that made her tactical assessment even more grim. Several passengers were attempting to help Maria, but they were untrained civilians facing a professional killer who now had access to purpose-built combat equipment. The younger terrorist, his intelligence file had identified him as Dmitry Kozlov, former Russian military with extensive experience in electronic warfare, had abandoned subtlety entirely. In his hands was a weapon that looked like it had been assembled from components designed to appear innocuous individually, but deadly when combined. A collapsible stock, a short barrel, and what appeared to be a high-capacity magazine loaded with ammunition that had somehow bypassed airport security. He fired a single shot into the cabin ceiling, and the sound of the gunshot in the confined space was like a physical blow. Passengers screamed and dove for cover, while Maria threw herself behind a serving cart that wouldn't stop a determined airsoft pellet, much less a military-grade projectile. "Everyone sit down and shut up," Kozlov shouted in heavily accented English. "Anyone who moves dies." But Reaper was already moving, using the passenger panic as concealment for her approach. She'd spent years learning to navigate chaotic battlefields, and a panicked aircraft cabin was just another operational environment. The key was to stay low, move fast, and strike before her opponent could acquire a clear target. Kozlov saw her coming and tried to bring his weapon to bear, but the narrow aisle and scattered passengers made it difficult to get a clean shot. Reaper used this to her advantage, weaving between seats and using panicked travelers as inadvertent cover. When she was close enough, she launched herself at him in a diving tackle that carried both of them over the beverage cart Maria had been hiding behind. The improvised weapon flew from Kozlov's hands, clattering somewhere among the seats, but he was far from helpless. His hand-to-hand combat training was evident as he twisted out of Reaper's grip and drove a knee toward her ribs. She absorbed the impact and responded with an elbow strike that connected with his jaw, snapping his head back and buying her the second she needed to establish a dominant position. But Kozlov was younger, stronger, and desperate, and he fought with the fury of someone who knew capture meant life imprisonment or execution. His hands found her throat, and suddenly Reaper was fighting for her life against an opponent who matched her training with superior physical strength. Black spots began appearing at the edges of her vision as his thumbs pressed against her carotid arteries, cutting off blood flow to her brain. In that moment, with unconsciousness approaching and innocent lives hanging in the balance, Reaper made a decision that connected her directly to the call sign she'd earned over the skis of Afghanistan. She stopped fighting defensively and embraced the cold, brutal efficiency that had once made her legendary among ground troops who'd watched her rain death on enemy positions. Her knee came up between Kozlov's legs with enough force to lift him off the cabin floor. As his grip on her throat loosened, she drove her thumbs into his eyes with surgical precision, applying pressure to nerve centers that would cause immediate incapacitation without permanent damage. He released her throat entirely, hands flying to his face, and Reaper finished the engagement with a strike to his temple that sent him crashing into the nearest row of seats. He slumped to the floor and remained motionless. 2 down, 1 to go. But as she turned to check on the team leader she'd neutralized earlier, Reaper's tactical awareness screamed a warning. The older man was no longer where she'd left him. Despite the devastating blow to his head, he'd somehow regained consciousness and disappeared into the chaos of the panicked cabin. This was the mark of a true professional, someone who could absorb significant physical damage and continue operating, who could use confusion and disorder to mask his movements, who understood that the real battle often began after the obvious fighting had ended. Reaper began a systematic search of the cabin, moving with predatory patience through the scattered passengers and crew. Her training told her that the team leader was still aboard. There was nowhere else for him to go, but he could be anywhere, waiting for the optimal moment to complete whatever backup plan he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. She found him near the emergency exit over the wing, working with focused intensity on something that made her blood freeze. An improvised explosive device, probably constructed from components that had appeared harmless individually, but were deadly in combination. He wasn't trying to take control of the aircraft anymore. He was trying to destroy it. The device in his hands was small but sophisticated, connected to what appeared to be a barometric trigger that would detonate the explosive when the aircraft reached a certain altitude, probably during its final approach to Shannon International, when the resulting crash would occur over populated areas rather than the open ocean. "Don't move," Reaper said quietly, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone prepared to use lethal force immediately. The older man looked up at her with eyes that held no fear, only the calm resignation of a professional who'd always known his career would probably end violently. "Too late," he said in accented English. "Device is armed. Any interference triggers immediate detonation." Reaper studied the device with the focused intensity of someone whose life had often depended on understanding enemy equipment under extreme time pressure. The bomb appeared to be sophisticated, probably military-grade explosives with a tamper-proof trigger mechanism. But even the most advanced devices had weaknesses if you understood the underlying principles. "What's your target?" she asked, buying time to analyze the device's construction. "London burns tonight," he replied with the fervor of someone who'd found meaning in mass murder. "Your decadent society pays the price for its crimes." "What crimes?" Reaper kept her voice conversational, but her hands were moving with subtle precision toward tools she could use to disarm the device, or at least minimize its effectiveness. The older man's eyes blazed with fanatic intensity. "You export your corruption across the world, destroy traditional societies, turn children against their parents and wives against their husbands. Tonight, the world sees that America and its allies are not invincible." Reaper had heard similar rhetoric from dozens of terrorists and insurgents over the years, and she'd long ago stopped trying to understand the psychology that could justify mass murder in the name of political ideology. Her job wasn't to reform extremists. It was to stop them from killing innocent people. "The device," she said calmly, "how do I disarm it?" His smile was cold and triumphant. "You cannot. In approximately 15 minutes, when this aircraft descends through 8,000 feet on approach to Shannon, the barometric trigger will detonate. The explosion will destroy the aircraft and kill everyone aboard, but we will have proven that your security is worthless, your people are vulnerable, and your way of life is doomed." 15 minutes. Reaper felt the familiar ice-cold calculation flowing through her veins as she processed this new tactical reality. The device was probably real, probably armed, and probably beyond her ability to disarm safely. But 15 minutes was enough time to implement alternative solutions. She keyed her concealed radio, opening a channel to the cockpit. "Captain Barnes, this is Reaper. We have a problem." "What's your status, Colonel?" "Two hostiles neutralized, but the team leader has armed an improvised explosive device with a barometric trigger. The device will detonate when we descend through 8,000 feet." Static filled the radio channel for several seconds before Barnes responded. "Jesus Christ, can you disarm it?" Reaper studied the device again, nodding the sophisticated trigger mechanism and what appeared to be anti-tamper protections. "Negative, but I may have an alternative solution. How much fuel do we have?" "Approximately 4 hours at current consumption rate." "Why?" "Because we're not going to Shannon." The older terrorist's expression shifted from triumph to confusion as he realized that his carefully planned attack was about to be countered by tactics he hadn't anticipated. Reaper had spent 8 years learning to improvise solutions to impossible problems, and this was just another operational challenge with unconventional parameters. "Captain, I need you to climb to maximum altitude and maintain level flight. Do not descend below 10,000 feet under any circumstances. Contact NORAD and tell them we need an emergency solution for mid-air explosive device disposal." "Colonel, we don't have the fuel to stay at altitude indefinitely." "We don't need to stay up here forever," Reaper replied, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who'd found a path through an impossible situation. "We just need to stay up here long enough." What she didn't say over the radio, but what every person in the cockpit would understand once they thought it through, was that her solution involved transferring the explosive device from a passenger aircraft at cruising altitude to somewhere it could detonate safely without killing innocent people. The older terrorist seemed to grasp her intentions because his expression shifted from confusion to grudging respect. "You would sacrifice yourself to save these people?" "If necessary," Reaper replied without hesitation, "but I'm hoping it won't come to that." She was lying, of course. Her plan involved exactly that kind of sacrifice, but she'd learned long ago that maintaining operational security meant not revealing your complete tactical intentions to enemy combatants, even when they were defeated and disarmed. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission from NORAD. "Reaper, this is General Patterson. We're tracking your situation. Be advised, RAF has scrambled interceptor aircraft from Scotland. ETA to your position is approximately 30 minutes. "Copy that, NORAD. What are the intercept protocols?" There was a pause before Patterson responded, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a death sentence. "Reaper, if that device detonates at altitude, the debris field could endanger other aircraft and shipping. Our primary concern has to be limiting casualties." Reaper understood the subtext perfectly. If the bomb exploded while the aircraft was over populated areas, NORAD would order the RAF fighters to shoot down United 447 rather than allow it to crash into a city. 312 passengers and crew would die to prevent potentially thousands of ground casualties. Unless she found another solution. "NORAD, I'm going to attempt manual disposal of the device. Stand by for updates." The older terrorist's eyes widened as he realized what she was planning. "You cannot remove the device. Any movement triggers immediate detonation." "We'll see," Reaper replied calmly. What the terrorist didn't know was that Reaper had extensive experience with improvised explosive devices from her combat deployments. She'd seen every type of trigger mechanism, from simple timers to sophisticated pressure plates, and she'd learned to recognize the difference between real threats and psychological warfare. The device appeared to be genuine, but the anti-tamper protections looked more impressive than functional. Most importantly, the terrorists' claim that any movement would trigger detonation was almost certainly false. If that were true, the normal vibrations and movements of flight would have already set it off. But even if she could move the device safely, removing it from the aircraft at 37,000 feet presented its own challenges. Commercial aircraft weren't designed for mid-air cargo disposal, and she'd need to find a way to get the bomb outside the pressurized cabin without causing explosive decompression that would kill everyone aboard. The emergency exit over the wing was her best option, but using it would require precise timing, careful pressure equalization, and probably more luck than any reasonable person had a right to expect. She was still calculating the technical requirements when Maria Santos appeared at her side, carrying what appeared to be an emergency oxygen tank. "Colonel, I don't know what you're planning, but you're going to need this," Maria said quietly. "And there's something else. One of the passengers is an explosives expert. British Army, retired. He says he might be able to help." Reaper looked at the oxygen tank, then at Maria's determined expression, and realized that she wasn't going to be facing this challenge alone. The crew and passengers of United 447 were preparing to fight back against the terrorism that threatened them, each contributing whatever skills and resources they could muster. "Send him over," she said finally. "And Maria, start preparing the cabin for emergency decompression. This is going to get interesting." As Maria moved away to coordinate with the other crew members, Reaper turned her attention back to the terrorist and his device. The older man was watching her with the fascination of someone observing a chess master attempting an impossible gambit. "You realize," he said conversationally, "that even if you successfully remove the device from the aircraft, you will die in the attempt. At this altitude, without proper equipment, you have perhaps 30 seconds of useful consciousness." "30 seconds is more time than I usually need," Reaper replied, and meant it. She'd spent 8 years learning to accomplish impossible things in impossibly short time frames. 30 seconds was enough time to save 312 innocent people, and that was a trade she was prepared to make without hesitation. The only question was whether she could execute the plan before the RAF fighters arrived with orders to shoot down her aircraft and everyone aboard it. Outside the cabin windows, the stars wheeled silently overhead, indifferent to the human drama playing out 7 miles below their ancient light. But inside the pressurized aluminum tube hurtling through the night sky, the final phase of the battle for United Flight 447 was about to begin. And this time, the Reaper was going to earn her call sign in the most literal way possible. The British Army explosives expert turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s named James Crawford, whose calm demeanor and steady hands immediately marked him as someone who'd spent years working with devices designed to kill. He examined the terrorist's bomb with professional detachment, his weathered fingers tracing the trigger mechanism and explosive components with the delicate touch of a surgeon. "Semtex," he said quietly, "probably about 2 pounds worth, enough to destroy the aircraft completely. The trigger appears to be barometric, as advertised, but there's also a secondary timer mechanism." He looked up at Reaper with grim eyes. "We have approximately 12 minutes before it detonates regardless of altitude." The older terrorist smiled with satisfaction. "Backup systems," he explained to Reaper with professional courtesy. "In case your pilots attempted exactly what they're doing now, maintaining altitude to avoid the primary trigger." Reaper felt the familiar cold calculation flowing through her mind as she processed this new information. 12 minutes was enough time to attempt manual disposal, but it eliminated any possibility of waiting for RAF support or NORAD assistance. Whatever solution she implemented, it had to happen immediately. "Can you disarm it?" she asked Crawford. He shook his head slowly. "Anti-tamper mechanisms are too sophisticated. Any attempt to interfere with the trigger will cause immediate detonation. Our only option is physical removal from the aircraft." "At 37,000 feet. "At 37,000 feet, he confirmed grimly. Reaper began her final tactical assessment, calculating the requirements for mid-air disposal of an armed explosive device from a commercial aircraft at cruising altitude. The emergency exit over the wing was her only viable option, but using it would require precise coordination between herself, the flight crew, and potentially several passengers. "Maria," she called to the senior flight attendant, "I need you to prepare the cabin for controlled decompression. Move all passengers as far forward as possible, secure all loose objects, and make sure everyone has oxygen masks ready." "Colonel," Maria's voice carried a note of desperation, "if you open that exit at altitude, won't the pressure differential?" "Kill me instantly," Reaper finished. "Probably, but if I don't open it, the bomb kills everyone." She turned to Crawford. "Can you help me move the device?" The retired British Army engineer nodded without hesitation. "It'll be the most dangerous thing I've ever done, but yes." "And the most dangerous thing you'll ever do," added a new voice. Reaper turned to see Captain Barnes standing in the aisle, his face pale but determined. "Colonel, I can't let you sacrifice yourself without exploring every alternative. What if we tried to land immediately? Emergency descent, maximum rate." "The barometric trigger would detonate the device as soon as we pass through 8,000 feet, Crawford explained. "We'd be overpopulated areas. The casualties would be catastrophic." "What about emergency ascent, maximum altitude?" Reaper considered this option briefly. Commercial aircraft could climb higher than their normal operational ceiling in emergency situations, but the thin air at extreme altitude would eventually force them back down. "How high can this aircraft go?" "Theoretical maximum is about 45,000 feet, Barnes replied. "But we'd burn through our emergency oxygen in less than an hour, and fuel consumption would increase dramatically." "How dramatically?" Barnes was quiet for a moment, running calculations in his head. "At maximum altitude, we'd have perhaps 90 minutes of flight time remaining." 90 minutes wasn't enough to reach any suitable landing field, and it wasn't enough to wait for a sophisticated military solution. But it was enough time to implement the manual disposal plan with greater precision and reduced immediate risk. "Take us up," Reaper decided. "Maximum emergency climb. Buy me as much time as possible." As Barnes returned to the cockpit to coordinate the emergency ascent, Reaper and Crawford began preparing the explosive device for removal. The process required infinite delicacy. Any sudden movement or vibration could trigger the anti-tamper mechanisms, but both of them had extensive experience with similar devices under combat conditions. "On my count," Crawford whispered as they lifted the bomb from its position near the emergency exit. 1, 2, 3. They moved with synchronized precision, carrying the device toward the overwing exit, while Maria and the other flight attendants secured the cabin and prepared passengers for emergency decompression. The bomb seemed to weigh far more than its actual physical mass, as if the potential energy contained within its explosive core had somehow increased its gravitational pull. 10 minutes, Crawford noted, checking his watch. Reaper nodded, focusing entirely on the technical requirements of opening an aircraft emergency exit at 40,000 feet. The pressure differential would be enormous, approximately 8 pounds per square inch, trying to suck everything out of the cabin and into the thin air outside. The exit door itself weighed nearly 50 pounds and would become essentially weightless once the pressure equalized. But controlling its movement while wearing an emergency oxygen mask and handling an armed explosive device would require timing and strength she wasn't sure she possessed. "Colonel," came Captain Barnes' voice over the intercom, "we're passing through 42,000 feet. This is as high as we can safely go." The aircraft was now flying at an altitude where the air was too thin to support human life, where the temperature was 60 degrees below zero, where the atmospheric pressure was less than 3 pounds per square inch. Opening the emergency exit would expose the interior of the aircraft to conditions that would kill any unprotected human in seconds. But it would also allow her to dispose of the explosive device safely, far from any populated areas, where its detonation would harm nothing but empty sky. "Crawford," she said quietly, "this is where we find out if we're as good as we think we are." The British engineer managed a grim smile. "Colonel, I've been defusing bombs for 30 years. If I'm going to die, I can't think of a better way to go than trying to save 300 innocent people." Reaper felt a surge of respect for the man who'd volunteered to help her with a task that would almost certainly kill them both. But as she prepared to open the emergency exit, she realized that dying wasn't really the issue. The issue was succeeding long enough to ensure that everyone else lived. She strapped on her emergency oxygen mask and prepared to earn her call sign one final time. "Maria," she called out, 30 seconds to decompression. Make sure everyone is secured." The cabin fell silent except for the steady drone of the aircraft engines and the quiet hiss of emergency oxygen systems. 310 passengers and crew members waited in their seats, trusting their lives to a woman most of them had never seen before tonight. Outside the small window beside the emergency exit, the stars burned with cold fire against the infinite darkness of space. At 42,000 feet, United Flight 447 was flying at the very edge of the atmosphere, where the sky began to fade from blue to black, and the curvature of the Earth became visible on the horizon. It was, Reaper thought, a beautiful place to die if you were dying to save innocent lives. She placed her hands on the emergency exit release mechanism and began the sequence that would either save everyone aboard the aircraft or kill them all in the next 60 seconds. "Crawford," she said quietly into her oxygen mask, "it's been an honor." "Likewise, Colonel. See you on the other side." Reaper pulled the emergency exit release handle, and the door of United Flight 447 opened onto the thin, deadly air of the stratosphere. The decompression was instantaneous and violent. Despite their preparation, the sudden pressure differential hit the cabin like an explosion in reverse, sucking loose objects, papers, and anything not secured toward the opening with tremendous force. The temperature inside the aircraft plummeted from a comfortable 72 degrees to -40 in seconds, and the roar of escaping air was so loud it drowned out everything except the most essential communication. But Reaper and Crawford were ready. They'd positioned themselves carefully, braced against seats and structural elements, with the explosive device secured between them in a specially improvised carrier that Crawford had constructed from aircraft safety equipment. Both wore emergency oxygen masks and had secured themselves with makeshift tethers that would prevent them from being sucked out of the aircraft during the disposal operation. 5 minutes, Crawford shouted over the roar of escaping air, his voice barely audible even through the intercom system. Reaper nodded and began maneuvering the bomb toward the open exit. The device had to be thrown clear of the aircraft with enough force to ensure it wouldn't be caught in the slipstream and impact the fuselage or wing structures. At their current speed and altitude, they had perhaps a 3-second window to dispose of the device safely. But as she prepared to throw the bomb into the thin air outside, something went wrong. The older terrorist, who had been secured along with the other passengers, had somehow freed himself from his restraints. Despite his injuries, despite being under guard, despite the chaos of emergency decompression, he'd managed to position himself near the emergency exit. "If I cannot complete the mission," he screamed over the noise, "then nobody survives." He lunged toward the bomb, not to disarm it, but to trigger the anti-tamper mechanisms that would cause immediate detonation inside the aircraft cabin. His hands reached for the trigger assembly just as Reaper was preparing to throw the device clear. The next few seconds unfolded with the nightmarish clarity that comes during moments of absolute crisis. Reaper saw the terrorist's hands reaching for the bomb, knew that any contact with the anti-tamper mechanisms would kill everyone aboard the aircraft, and realized that she had perhaps half a second to prevent 312 people from dying in a fireball 42,000 feet above the North Atlantic. She did the only thing that her training, her experience, and her fundamental nature would allow her to do. She wrapped her arms around both the terrorist and the explosive device and threw herself out of the aircraft. The last thing she heard before the roar of wind and engine noise overwhelmed everything else was Captain Barnes' voice over the intercom. "Godspeed, Reaper." At 42,000 feet above the ocean, falling at terminal velocity through air so thin it couldn't support human life, Lieutenant Colonel Sage, Reaper, Blackwood had approximately 30 seconds to live. But 30 seconds was enough time to ensure that the explosive device would detonate harmlessly, far from the aircraft and the innocent people aboard it. She'd earned her call sign by bringing death to her enemies from the sky. Now she was earning it by taking death away from those she'd sworn to protect. The bomb exploded 8 seconds later, a brief flash of light against the star-filled darkness that was visible from the aircraft but harmless to everyone aboard. The older terrorist died instantly, his fanatic mission finally ended, and Reaper, falling through the thin air of the stratosphere, had just enough time to feel satisfaction that she'd saved every life aboard United Flight 447. It was, she thought in her final moments, exactly the kind of death she would have chosen if she'd been given the choice. Above her, the aircraft continued its emergency descent toward Shannon International, where Irish Emergency Services and RAF interceptor aircraft were waiting to ensure the safe landing of 310 people who would never know the name of the woman who died to save them. But in the cockpit, Captain Barnes keyed his radio for one final transmission. "NORAD, this is United 447. Device neutralized. Reaper is down. All passengers and crew safe. Request priority landing at Shannon." "Copy 447. Well done. Reaper's sacrifice will not be forgotten." The aircraft descended through the night sky, carrying its cargo of survivors toward safety, while below in the dark waters of the North Atlantic, the woman who'd earned the name Reaper twice in one night disappeared beneath the waves. In the months that followed, the story of United Flight 447 became legend within military circles. The official reports were classified, but word spread among aircrew and special operations personnel about the retired A-10 pilot who'd single-handedly defeated 3 professional terrorists and sacrificed her life to save hundreds of innocent people. They said she'd earned her call sign over the skis of Afghanistan by bringing death to Taliban fighters who'd been attacking a surrounded Marine unit. They said she'd saved Bravo Company by expending every round of ammunition she carried, making attack run after attack run until her aircraft was nearly shot out from under her. But those who knew the full story of United Flight 447 said she'd truly earned the name Reaper the night she'd thrown herself out of an aircraft at 42,000 feet, carrying a bomb and a terrorist with her into the darkness to ensure that innocent people lived. Captain Mitchell Barnes retired from commercial aviation 6 months after the incident. He never flew again without thinking about the woman who'd saved his aircraft and everyone aboard it. In his final logbook entry, he wrote simply, "Some people are born to fly. Others are born to make sure the rest of us can fly safely. Reaper was both." Maria Santos continued working as a flight attendant, but she never again complained about difficult passengers or challenging flights. When new crew members asked her why she always seemed so calm during emergencies, she would tell them about a night over the North Atlantic when she learned what real courage looked like. James Crawford, the British Army explosives expert, returned to his quiet retirement in Scotland. But sometimes, on clear nights, he would look up at the stars and remember a woman who'd been willing to die alongside a complete stranger to save people they'd never met. The families of the passengers aboard United Flight 447 never knew how close they'd come to losing everything. They landed safely at Shannon International, were processed through emergency facilities, and eventually continued to their destinations, with nothing more than an interesting story about an unscheduled stop in Ireland. But in the classified archives of NORAD and the Royal Air Force, in the personnel files of the United States Air Force, and in the memory of everyone who'd been aboard that aircraft, the story of Lieutenant Colonel Sage Reaper Blackwood became something more than history. It became legend. The kind of story that gets told in military briefing rooms and pilot training facilities, whispered among aircrew who understand the weight of responsibility that comes with holding other people's lives in your hands. The kind of story that reminds everyone who hears it why some people choose to serve, why they're willing to sacrifice everything for strangers they'll never meet. And sometimes, late at night in bars near military bases around the world, old pilots tell the story of Reaper to younger aviators who think they understand what courage means. They tell them about a woman who'd left the military because she was tired of killing, but who'd found herself on a commercial flight when innocent people needed someone willing to die for them. They tell them about how she'd fought 3 professional terrorists with improvised weapons and tactical brilliance, how she defused a bomb that could have killed hundreds, and how she'd ultimately thrown herself out of an aircraft to ensure that everyone else lived. And when the younger pilots ask if the story is true, the older ones just smile and order another drink. Doesn't matter if it's true, they say, it's what we aspire to be. Because in the end, that's what the story of United Flight 447 really represents. The idea that when innocent lives are threatened, there will always be someone willing to stand between evil and those who cannot protect themselves. Someone willing to pay any price, make any sacrifice, accept any risk to ensure that good people get to go home to their families. The passengers who landed safely at Shannon that night went on to live their lives, pursue their dreams, raise their children, and make their contributions to the world. They never knew that their ability to do so depended on a woman whose name they never learned, whose face they never saw, whose sacrifice they never understood. But in the cosmic accounting that weighs heroism against loss, courage against fear, sacrifice against self-preservation, the equation balanced perfectly. 310 people lived full lives because one person chose to die well. Lieutenant Colonel Sage, Reaper, Blackwood had earned her call sign twice, once as a bringer of death to those who deserved it, and once as a guardian of life for those who didn't deserve to die. In the end, it was the second definition that mattered most. The official investigation into the terrorist attack on United Flight 447 was conducted jointly by the FBI, MI6, and Interpol. The 3 terrorists were identified as part of a larger network that had been planning coordinated attacks against commercial aviation, but their deaths aboard the aircraft had effectively ended the immediate threat. The improvised explosive device was analyzed from fragments recovered from the North Atlantic, and investigators marveled at its sophistication. The bomb had been constructed from components that appeared harmless individually, but were deadly when combined, a level of planning and technical expertise that suggested state sponsorship and extensive resources. But the official reports, classified at the highest levels, focused less on the technical details of the terrorist plot and more on the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood. Intelligence analysts studied her tactical decisions, her improvised weapons usage, her coordination with civilian crew members, and her ultimate sacrifice with the kind of detailed attention usually reserved for military operations of strategic significance. She turned a commercial aircraft into a battlefield and won, wrote one analyst, against professional opponents with improvised weapons while protecting hundreds of noncombatants. It's the kind of tactical performance that gets studied at war colleges. But the most significant analysis came from Major General Patterson, Reaper's former commanding officer, who wrote in his classified assessment, Colonel Blackwood exemplified the highest traditions of military service. When faced with an impossible situation, she found a way to win. When victory required ultimate sacrifice, she paid the price without hesitation. Her actions aboard United Flight 447 represent the finest example of military professionalism and personal courage I have witnessed in 35 years of service. The families of the passengers were never told the complete story of what had happened aboard their flight. The official explanation described a security incident that had been resolved by crew members and passengers working together. The media reported it as an example of successful airline security protocols and international cooperation. Only a few people knew the truth. that a retired A-10 pilot had single-handedly saved hundreds of lives through skill, courage, and ultimate sacrifice. And most of those people were bound by classification requirements that would keep the story secret for decades. But secrets have a way of